definitely only have 7 minutes, so it's because all the other excellent speakers spoke so eloquently and at length about their own views. It's fine, I don't mind. I want to start off with a quote from Marx, which is in many ways my favourite quote. She said that sometimes a day can take 20 years, and other times 20 years can happen in a day. And I think that really kind of, for me, sums up the potential and the danger that is lodged in the present situation. Because in the last session we were talking about how one of the features of modernism, the modern world, if you will, is that all that is solid melts into air. It's constantly shifting, it's constantly moving. We were just talking about temp workers, for goodness sake. I mean, like, sometimes you don't even know when you're going to be working day after day. This is very much a feature of the modern age. And of course, for us as, well, those of us that are Marxists in the room, we can say this is a very good thing that Marx, and it's very useful for us in the workers' movement to understand that, but I think also the capitalists understand that. And if you think about what Milton Friedman said, I like quoting Marx, I don't like quoting Milton Friedman, but Milton Friedman did say something which I think really encapsulates what the boss's strategy is at the moment, which is that he said that if you want to create real, lasting, structural reforms in society, then you need a crisis, one that is either real or perceived. And the bosses now are using the crisis, which is a real crisis by the way, but the way that the crisis is perceived in particular to make the 20 years happen in a day. And you can really see that with the Tory government at the moment, because what we're facing in Britain is the kind of attacks that working people and the poor are facing all over the world, but in Britain, particularly bad, because we really are, one of the countries at the heart of finance capital, where all the, problems really sort of, are coming from as well. Where we're really facing shock and awe politics and economics against us, which is why you can see, I mean, Thatcher wasn't so ambitious with her programme of reforms that she had in the 1980s. This coalition government is trying to ram through so many changes to the economy, to society, and so on, that it's no wonder that people are increasingly saying how, yes, there's a crisis of capitalism, but there's also a crisis of the left. The left doesn't seem to be reacting in the way that you would imagine it to. Stathis Kouvarakis wrote an article in International Socialist Journal saying that what we have now is a real, a serious crisis of capitalism, what Gramsci called an organic crisis, what Trotsky called a crisis of the system as a whole. But a lot of the left seem to be responding to it in pretty much the same old ways as they always respond to it. These kind of front campaigns and some petitions and things like that, and maybe we'll have a demonstration. We really need another demonstration to try and save the NHS, or try and save that, or try and stop these cuts from coming through. If you look at how serious the bourgeoisie are taking it now, and what kind of country they want Britain to be in the next 4 or 5 years, and you look at the scale of our resistance to it, you can see there's a very serious gap that's opening up. And that is why I think meetings like this are very important for us to really try and get this right. Because if we don't get this right in the next few years, if we don't manage to create the kind of movement which can actually not just stop the attacks, but roll them back, and actually win some things back for the working class, then indeed Britain will be a very nasty, brutish, horrible country, as Brendan Barber said only last year. Now, I want to kind of follow on from what John McDonnell said yesterday at the rally which we had, where he was talking about the different kind of strategies which have opened up. And he said, he was sensible enough to say definitely, that there's the parliamentary strategy, there's the kind of trade union strategy, and there's the kind of direct action strategy. Now, John McDonnell said that the parliamentary strategy, the way of changing society through parliament, getting elected, passing laws and things like that, isn't very popular at the moment. I think that's quite clear. And I think one of the reasons for that unpopularity is that the party which is most associated with the capacity to do that, the Labour Party, isn't really looked at the moment as the kind of party which is going to be able to deliver any serious defence or counter-reforms or anything like that. And that's I think, a very real feature that we have in Britain. It's a feature in a lot of other European countries as well. General decline of social democracy. And I mean, people say that sort of, from my position as a Bolshevik, kind of the idea you could have a revolution in Britain is crazy, but I feel particularly sorry for Owen having to try and get John McDonnell elected to be leader of the Labour Party, because that seems like an even more thankless task at the moment. And I think that's a very real thing. So it's no wonder people, when they're so disillusioned from the establishment, they turn to the streets, they turn to direct action, civil disobedience, you know, rather than voting. That doesn't change anything. Let's go and set up a tent city outside of St. Paul's, or now I think they've got one set up outside of Bank tube station as well, so it's growing. You know, this is a growing movement. I think this is a response to the question of where power really lies in society as well, which I think is something that we need to think about. Because the idea that there's any real power in Parliament, of course, I just don't really think that's true. Of course, Parliament has some powers, it can pass laws, you know, and things like that, but it only really has power in the sense that we respect those laws, or, when we don't respect it, the fact that the police come in and enforce those laws over the rest of us. The real power, I think, you know, that people are trying to challenge at the moment, whether it's, you know, movements in Tahrir Square, whether it's, you know, the Occupy Wall Street movement, or what's happening in Britain, is the power relationship between capital and labour. Either the boss comes in and says, you've lost your job, you're on a lower wage, I'm ripping up that contract now, and workers either accept it, there's nothing we can do, unions aren't very strong, or whatever, or they fight back against it. Or the power relationship between the state proper, the police and so on, and the civil movements. You can see that with, as mentioned, Mark Duggan earlier. You know, there's a lot of kind of anger at the moment in Britain against police brutality, and people, you know, wanting to kind of resist that and make a cause against it. And in that sense, you can really begin to see how the political coordinates in Britain are shifting and changing and adapting as the situation of neoliberalism changes, as there's a decline of democratic forms, as there's a decline of the Labour Party's ability to capture the mood of resistance and translate that into votes and parliamentary power to make a difference. And of course, Owen's completely right to say that we live in an age of mass revolts. Revolts about different things, but all pointing in the same direction, at different speeds, not all agreeing on every single thing, but certainly against dictatorship, certainly against exploitation, against social oppression, and certainly demanding some kind of different world, some kind of better world. And that, of course, is where the left comes in, because the left has to be that part of this political spectrum which says, of course we've got answers to this, of course we know what direction that we need to go in society. But I also agree with what some of the speakers said just now, that the left also itself is either lacking in confidence to put forward that alternative, it's shy about socialism, if you will, or even when it's quite bold about it, it still has a problem, because, you know, let's be honest, standing here as a Bolshevik, it's quite common kind of ideas amongst people that that project failed. You had 1917, you had the Soviet Union, you had, you know, 1/3 of the world under this, you know, under this kind of alternative to capitalism, and it collapsed. And that's a very real argument that socialists have to deal with and have to fight against today. What I want to propose in this meeting is that we begin to take that discussion forward. I know we can't really do it now because of how long the speakers have gone on for, but we do want more time for debate, honestly, but I'll wrap up on this, I suppose, is the thing. Look, we're in a very real, serious crisis of capitalism, not just in Britain, but internationally. And I think the crisis is beholden on us, as people on the left, to begin to think about how things are now, what's wrong about them, and how we can begin to do things differently. And I certainly think that we need an open and honest discussion amongst different organisations, amongst individuals, amongst people who are leading trade union disputes, like Mick is there, people who are writing very important, influential books, people who are helping to run, you know, websites which are putting up these different positions, the students who are involved in the demonstrations and protests. We need to have an open discussion about what kind of organisation we need in Britain to be able to really take the fight to the capitalists, to stop just spending time on defensive struggles and trying to defend what was and is now rapidly fading into nothing, but how we can put forward a real positive agenda for social change in Britain and internationally, which confronts the capitalists, which confronts their police agents, which confronts everything that is despicable and disgusting about this system, and lays the groundwork for an alternative. And in that sense, I think we need to be talking about rank-and-file movements, a united anti-cuts movement, supporting the Palestinians, the Arab revolutions. We need to have a clear anti-capitalist message to it. That might mean different things to different people, but I think we can have that discussion out within those forums. And I think it should also be an organisation which says, we're not embarrassed about having iPhones, we want iPhones for everyone. And I was looking at the platform earlier, someone talking about iPhones, it's quite curious to yes. Not just iPhones for everyone, but the workers who make those iPhones in China, for goodness sake, themselves have better conditions, and we build the kind of international movement. If people are complaining about there's no industrial workers in Britain, there's plenty in China, there's plenty in India. That's why we need an international organisation as well, because we're not just talking about the conditions we have here, of call centres and precarious work, but we're talking about an international class which exists under those conditions of exploitation and oppression and needs to be therefore organised in order to fight back. I think there's lots of examples in the world today where new forms of organisation are being created. It's like PSOL, Antarcia, the NPA in France, even our own comrades from the League for the Fifth International in the Czech Republic who are members of the new anti-capitalist left. And I think that these kind of organisations are crucial to help overcome some of the barriers and divisions which the left suffers from, to create a sense of credibility as well that the left is trying to overcome these barriers themselves and can put forward that positive alternative. And I'll end on this point, because I think that one of the reasons why socialism is not seen as credible, or like why it's capitalist realism, sort of like all we can do is just kind of live with the system at the moment, is because of the very real material strength of liberal democracy after the Second World War. Trotsky predicted that liberal democracy would collapse after the Second World War. He was proven wrong. It actually grew massively. There's more countries in the world today which are technically democracies. I know like a lot of the African nations are technically democracies, but you know, there's all kinds of problems there, as there are in Britain with corruption and, you know, self-seeking politicians and things like that. But that kind of strength of liberal democracy, I think, is really being challenged. It's being challenged by the people of Occupy Wall Street. It's being challenged by the people of Occupy St. Paul's, I call them sometimes, by Occupy the London Stock Exchange. It's being challenged by these new people who are coming into resistance, who are naming the enemy as capitalism, finance capital, the bosses, and, you know, attacking the hypocrisy of the bourgeois politicians which are supporting and defending this system and have got no answers for us, have got no real answers for working people, for the poor, for how to get us out of this crisis, apart from to break the backs of working class people in order to make sure that the bankers and the profit mongers get out of this system with their skins intact. And therefore I think there's real possibility. We shouldn't be pessimistic, and we shouldn't be downhearted about the possibilities that have opened up for us, because I think anything can happen. Sometimes a day takes 20 years, and other times 20 years can happen in a day, and that has to be our perspective in the coming years. I mean, I'll take myself. I mean, I think that sort of there's a lot of agreement around, you know, sort of some of the problems and the way to go forward. And I mean, one thing that you often hear is that, you know, we need more unity. We need to link up the struggles. I mean, the example of the electricians and the students coming together in the City of London with the Occupy London Stock Exchange movement, you know, could be a very explosive event on November the 9th politically. But I mean, of course, sort of, you know, like, that's great. And I mean, quite a few people talk about unity in that sense. Like, I'm not doing it down. I think it's very important that we have to keep on reminding ourselves and the movement that, you know, we need to have united common cause. But I think that, you know, it needs to go a bit beyond that. We need to start thinking a bit more about the strategic issues that are coming up, because if unity is simply let's all have a demo on the same day around the different issues, and we've got more numbers and, you know, like more kind of connections and things, I mean, that's fine, but I don't think that's really going to go far enough. And I think that's where kind of a wider discussion about not only the alternative that we want, but how we get there, i.e. the kind of tactics and strategies and even slogans that we employ to do it, is very important. In that sense, I mean, I agree with the people who said, you know, programme has to be at the front. Now, of course, I mean, the problem is that even within the movement itself, some people say programme is essential, but there's other people who are on the more kind of libertarian or like anti-capitalist wing who just don't, you know, think you just don't need a programme at all, or you need to kind of completely re-envisage sort of, even if you raise demand, like this, you know, there's this kind of slogan that some people use, which is occupy everything, demand nothing, as it were. Now, sort of, for someone from a Bolshevik background, that doesn't make any sense at all, because, I mean, like, surely the point of the occupations is to demand things, to place demands on, you know, the powers that be. But some people think even that's wrong, because if you put demands on people in power, then you're giving them power. Therefore, we shouldn't put demands on it. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's all these debates that we need to have out about it. And it does show that although there's unity, you know, on a lot of issues, there's also still a lot of looking at the same object from different points and coming up with different explanations for the way forward. What I will say about Bolshevism, I am a Bolshevik. I mean, yes. I try to be a Bolshevik as much as possible. I'll let you be the judge of that. But I mean, certainly what I think is that sort of, you know, Bolshevism does have a bad reputation, if you will. It kind of, you know, like people think it's kind of like undemocratic, it's bureaucratic, it's kind of obsessed with, you know, disputes which happened years ago, tendency to split all the time. I think that we need to reinvigorate the meaning of Bolshevism in its actual revolutionary, emancipatory potential. By that what I mean is, Lenin once said that all that Bolshevism really boils down to is those people in the workers' movement, it's a tendency within the workers' movement which is most consistent about the need for the working class to take power. And therefore from that task, from that strategic goal, flows the forms of organisation and methods that you need to do it, i.e. a certain amount of discipline. I mean, you can't overthrow the capitalist state if, you know, you can't be bothered to get out of bed, or you just say, oh, I'm not going to go to the meeting tonight, or like, you know, whatever. And so from that, I think we can begin to see a bit more common ground around what we mean by it. And like, Bolshevism isn't just some old thing like focusing on feudal Russia and therefore completely sort of like something which doesn't have any bearing today. It is that part of the movement which is most consistent on the issues of the working class taking power. I will just finish on two very quick things. One is Owen's point about the anti-globalisation movement. It is true, of course, that it was a movement of one no and many yeses, a bit like the Occupy movement at the moment. To some degree, that's a strength. At the beginning, it's a strength, because you can't just go in with a single demand or a single issue. At the beginning, you have to be very broad, because you have to involve as many people as possible. Then through a process of discussion and debate, you begin to clarify exactly what you're fighting around. But it wasn't just ideological confusion that stopped that movement, or the jingoism of the question of the war and things like that. It was also the brutality of the state. I mean, the anti-capitalist demonstrations, it wasn't just the kettling, although that was bad enough. I mean, in Italy, they killed someone, really sick. In Sweden, they shot someone in the back on a demonstration. I mean, you know, a lot of people were put in hospital going on those demonstrations. And the problem for the movement is that when the real force of the capitalist state came down on it, people didn't really know what to do. There was a lot of things at the time. There was the Tuta Bianchi, the white overall movement. It was kind of symbolic push and shove with the police, and some people wore crash helmets and things like that. But it wasn't generalised, it wasn't strategic enough, because people didn't really get to the point of what the state was doing and how to overthrow it, how to smash it in the act of a revolution. And that, in that sense, was where the ideology kind of confusion came in. But it was definitely under the blows of, you know, the batons and the police and the state, which reinforces the need for a revolutionary movement, not a reformist movement at the end of the day, because that's how the police are in society. The final thing I'll end on is the example of the student movement, because I think that's very important. Obviously, it's very good for us because Workers' Power played, you know, quite an important role in it. I wouldn't say we led the whole thing, of course, because it was quite a mass movement, and that would be terribly sort of egotistical. Not at all. But we did have, you know, sort of say in it. We went to the meetings, and we were very involved in the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts, which is really one of the organisations helping to coordinate it. But just to follow on from Richard's point, what did we learn from the student movement? I think three things. The first thing on the question of unity, it wasn't just my front's better than your front. There was real attempts by National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts to work with the SWP's Education Activist Network, to work with autonomous and libertarian students who weren't in either organisation. We really fought to set up student assemblies, education assemblies, which met on a weekly basis at ULU, and were real places where we discussed strategy, organised the route of the demo and the march, and, you know, had some of the debates out and things like that. That was a way of helping to overcome the sectarian squabbling and divisions by creating genuine democratic forums where people went and these things were like debated out, and, you know, and sort of decisions were made. I think also that the point the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts shows is that, you know, just as other people said, the whole reason why, you know, groups like that managed to move into a position of leadership, if you want to use that word, within the movement, is precisely because the traditional leaders in the NUS sold out. They didn't want to lead it, and they condemned it. And in that situation, and that's very applicable to the trade union movement, in that situation, you can take independent action if you build the rank and file movements that can make it possible. And that's a strategic task that we have today, to build these rank and file movements, as is happening in the electricians at the moment, precisely because the trade union leaders have exposed themselves, they're not willing to do it. Like, they don't want to do it at the end of the day. They want to have one day strike, demonstration, maybe not even that, and then that's the end of it. And we need more radical democratic organisations. And the final thing I think that the student movement shows us, and this links to the bread and butter issues that people were talking about. Krupskaya, well, there's this quote that's attributed to Krupskaya, who was a Bolshevik, who said that we started off with tea breaks and ventilation in workplaces, and we led the Russian working class right up to the armed insurrection. And I think that's something that we need to think about as well, because if you think about the student movement, yes, it was initially over tripling of tuition fees in the EMA, but a lot of students were chanting for free education, anti-Tory slogans, unity with the working class. They started off on their immediate issues, like what's affecting me, but because they were thrown into a struggle, their heads got filled with all kinds of new ideas and concepts, and it really shows you how in struggle people's consciousnesses can change. And that's what we really learned from that movement. I think that's an essential thing for us to build a movement in the future, and I think discussions like this are very important, despite some of the differences, in helping us to really plot a way forward to really fight against the government.